Politics in Myanmar, like politics everywhere, is a moving target. If you look at something long enough, it will change before your eyes. We've talked to our guest today, Michael Sladnick, a couple of times on our show about the different forms the fight against Myanmar's military dictatorship has taken. If the military forces that overthrew the elected government in 2021 thought it would be an easy process, they were really wrong. We've looked at the complicated relationship between the PDFs, the People's Defense Forces, and the armed groups organized around ethnic communities, some of which have been fighting Myanmar national governments for decades. We've seen grassroots civil disobedience activities that have demonstrations in rural areas on a daily basis, something that Michael's Facebook Myanmar Solidarity page shows extensively every day. If you haven't looked at this Facebook page or you've been involved on Instagram, you should do so. It's truly inspiring. We've also talked about the strikes that took place immediately after the coup, especially with the women workers in the country's garment industry. The military crackdown on the unions in response has been savage, with many union members killed or arrested and union leaders being arrested or forced into exile. Today we want to take a look at the implications of the revolution in Myanmar from a broader perspective, and we want to thank you for joining us in Facing Reality for Social Justice as we discuss the regional and international context of the struggle. At the end of our conversation with Michael, we'll hear the words of Khat Thi, one of Myanmar's most well-known poets, who was murdered by the junta shortly after they came to power. Poets are totally influential in Myanmar for their ability to express the hopes and feelings of thousands and thousands of people in the country as they fight for freedom. The words of Khat Thi will be in Burmese and then in translation. Before we begin our conversation with Michael, he tells us an important act of international solidarity at a time such solidarity is sorely needed.
Yeah, well, yesterday in Bangkok it was International LGBT Solidarity Awareness Day, and the LGBT Myanmar community in Bangkok did a protest, and one of the banners called for solidarity with Gaza. And this is an issue that has caught the attention of Myanmar people, and there's been other shows of solidarity, over the past months. Since the coup in Myanmar, people from there have looked to internationalize their struggle and to reach out to other oppressed groups, and a recognition that they can't just fight this alone and that they have to stand with other groups who are also facing oppression. And Palestinians and Gaza has been one of those places, and in particular because there's a clear recognized connection of a common oppressor that they're fighting, because Israel has been one of the main backers of the Myanmar military. Israel was the first country that started selling them advanced weapons in the 1990s after the violent crackdown against the 1988 revolution and after the military regime overturned the results of the 1990 elections. So people see, whether it's through solidarity with Palestinians or with other oppressed people and struggles all around the world, they see a connection and recognize that they're part of a global struggle and want to make that explicit.
Myanmar is in the center of Southeast Asia, where many countries have had fights for freedom and democracy. And I asked Michael how that has affected, one way or another, what's been going on currently in Myanmar.
Yeah, well, so when the coup happened and the Spring Revolution broke out in early 2021, it really felt like part of an international, regional wave of struggles at that time, because this was coming out of, in 2020, there was a wave of mass protests in Thailand in particular. And the three-finger salute that is the symbol of the Myanmar Spring Revolution came directly from that 2020 Thai democracy movement. That was the same symbol that they were using. So, right from the beginning, it seemed like more than just a Myanmar movement. This was a regional wave of uprisings against dictatorship, for democracy, for social justice. And in the early months of the revolution, the mass urban protest movement, they were trying to make that explicit, calling for an Asian Spring, calling for spreading the revolution to other Southeast Asian countries. And uh, has been tremors of that, but up until now, at that time, coming out of COVID, some of the other regional dictatorships and authoritarian so-called democracies had kind of fumbled the bag and were looking weak. So early in 2021, there was another, kind of revival of the protests in Thailand, and there were solidarity demonstrations with Myanmar and other neighboring countries, in particular in India, Northeast India, some of the states like Nagaland, Manipur, that have ethnic groups, populations that are closely connected to people on the Myanmar side of the border. So you had that sense that it was really possible to spread the movement, but up until now, the neighboring states have kind of held on and retrenched, and crackdown were needed to. And, so that hope of a real regional, international revolution has not been realized yet. But with the increasing crackdown in Myanmar, millions of people have fled the country. And there's another, I think even bigger wave of emigration and flight happening right now, since the military announced military conscription in February. And everyone is trying to flee the country, young people. And the military is trying to stop them, trying to close down avenues to leave, saying young men, even up until like their 40s or 50s, can no longer go abroad to work, putting new restrictions of the type of documents they need to leave, requiring them to get permission from local authorities. Despite all that, people are still trying to leave. So, this is the main international aspect of the revolution right now, is these Myanmar refugees and migrant worker communities abroad, all over the world, but especially in Thailand and other neighboring states. And there have been a number of struggles that have periodically broke out of those populations, of strikes against local abusive practices that they face by their employers and authorities in the countries they arrive, of solidarity demonstrations, but then in particular of just organizing support of the revolution. Because wherever ordinary, working class Myanmar people are, there is, revolutionaries. The ordinary working class people are the basis support of this revolution. They're the ones who are participating in it. They're the ones whose, best friends and classmates and cousins and brothers and sisters are the ones fighting and keeping this revolution going. So wherever these communities are, they are the ones, even when they're making, the least subsistence wages, who are doing everything possible to fund the revolution and to send money back home, not just to support their families like migrants communities do all over the world, but to fund, people who are fighting the revolutionary organizations.
The revolution in Myanmar is happening in a region where many people live in poverty and in desperate hope for a better future. It's impossible for what happens in one country not to have some effect on the surrounding areas. I've asked Michael to give us some sense of that influence. This is especially true when there is a migration of people from one country to another. This is especially a move to improve financial prospects and to support their families back home, but they don't all of a sudden forget the politics they left behind. Many of us know people in the United States who are from Mexico, and maybe left quite a long time ago, who are totally clued into the current political situation in Mexico and the race for president in that country. Some of us might have heard of the pre-World War I language federations in the U.S. Socialist Party and the radical and sometimes anarchist politics they brought from places like Italy. Is there some kind of similar reciprocal political exchange going on with Myanmar?
Yeah, no, unfortunately, there has not been a lot of organizational links created. And I think there's a couple factors why. First of all, there is just a big language and uh, gap between the different ethnicities, the different nationalities. When Myanmar people go to Thailand or other Southeast Asian countries, for example. So, most of them are the greatest number are in Thailand, and Burmese and Thai languages are completely different, far further apart than English and Spanish or other European languages. And, you know, when it's the working class people who are in both countries, the base of the revolution or the potential for revolutionary movement, they often struggle to overcome that barrier, especially at the beginning. If they've been established in Thailand for a long time, of course, they will learn the language. But when they're just arriving there, in the heat of flight as political refugees or, desperate, people fleeing war and fleeing conscription, it is difficult. And the other, even bigger side of it is the skill of the other authoritarian so-called democracies in Southeast Asia of decapitating, neutering their own democracy movements. That is the much bigger factor. In Thailand, they don't have the type of overt dictatorship like Myanmar has, where they just brutally crack down and they crack down on the ordinary people and brute mass widespread suppression. That is not how things work in Thailand. They have repeated elections going back since the 1970s, real fair democratic elections. But when they don't like the results, they have time and time and time again done a coup and overturned the election, and they purged the leadership. They smashed the organizations, the democratic organizations, the democratic parties, and then they organize another free election. So they, rather than, the big difference between Myanmar and Thailand is Thailand cracks down on leaders. They crack down on the organizational height, decapitate the organizations. They don't crack down on the ordinary people who are supporting democracy like in Myanmar. But the effect of that is that there is not this uh, effective revolutionary organizations in Thailand. There is not this like legacy of ongoing experience and leadership and organization that's needed to build a sustained oppositional movement. And in Myanmar, because of the crackdown, that had to go underground, and that was built over decades underground. And in Thailand, you have these weak organizations that will, flourish during periods like 2020 when you had the outbreak of mass struggle, and then the leaders get arrested and they kind of shrivel and don't go anywhere. So I think that is similar in other Southeast Asian countries, a similar problem that they formally have democratic rights, but they don't really have these robust democratic social justice organizations to directly work with.
There's a growing realization internationally about the situation in Myanmar that's expressed sometimes and in some places with solidarity groups forming, having demonstrations of various sizes in support of the fight against the military dictatorship and generally getting the word out. Michael has been living in the Myanmar area doing solidarity work for a couple of years, and I wondered how these groups relate to the on-the-ground actions happening and how they are seen by the people that he's working with.
You know, most of the solidarity organizations around the world are just based around the Myanmar diaspora. So the Myanmar diaspora is the main ones all over the world funding this revolution, almost only ones funding it, almost the only ones supporting it. And in some places, there will be other people from that area, from that country, who are participating in those Myanmar diaspora organized solidarity organizations. The one real exception to that, where there is solidarity being organized beyond just the diaspora, I would say has been South Korea. And in South Korea, the big labor unions and some organizations really on their own organized support and have donated. And, it was particularly visible early on and to some extent has continued. And I think the reason for that, why South Korea is an exception, is first of all, their similar experience of this democratic revolutionary struggle against dictatorship in the 1980s. And, their uprisings in 1980 and the achievement of democracy in 1987 through mass movement. And a lot of Myanmar people see that as an example of the type of movement they want to follow. And then also after that, after the transition to democracy, South Korea continued, especially in the first couple of decades, to be a highly authoritarian democracy that, would restrict even liberal politics, but also, working class organization, trade unions. And it was migrant worker who played a big role in the struggle in the 1990s and 2000s to fight for trade union rights. And Myanmar migrant workers in South Korea played a major role in that. Some of the leaders of that struggle, who even ordinary South Koreans might know, were Myanmar immigrants. So I think that recent historic role of Myanmar immigrant workers in the South Korean labor movement would explain why that was the one country where there was really some mobilization of solidarity.
One of the groups in Myanmar that has a history of fighting for human rights and trade union rights is the trade union movement. I remember seeing pictures of women factory workers in the garment industry having massive in-factory demonstrations against the coup in the months following the military takeover. Union leaders from Myanmar, people who are often now in exile, have been ceaseless in telling the world about what's happening to unions, to working conditions, and to companies taking an advantage by getting rid of contracts and forcing speed up in the garment industry. What's happening now on this front?
Yeah, I would say the unions played a key role in this revolution. But it was, a still developing, budding, nascent nationwide labor trade union movement that was just developing at the time that the coup happened and the revolution broke out. So the sections of the working class that were already organized, like in particular, the huge garment factories in Yangon, where, the mainly female rural migrant workforce, they were the ones who really stood up and turned this into a mass movement and called and actually built a general strike and these immense demonstrations that developed over the course of February 2021. And other sections of the working class as well that joined at were key in getting this movement and this general strike started at the beginning, were organized. The train workers all over Myanmar, they did CDM, joined the civil disobedience movement, and refused to work under the regime. The national trains, the local train system in Yangon, a lot of their workers were unionized, and they went, right away, pushed for the revolution, and their example got other sections of the labor force, other workers, to go out as well. The big copper mines in Yima Bin Salinji, the Lepidong mines, they had a history of trade union organizing there, and until this present day, they are one of the areas that the CDM movement is continuing, and where mass daily demonstrations are continuing around the mine. And so their political training all started with the labor unions. But the nature of this crackdown has made it difficult for union organizations to operate, at least to operate on a national scale like they did before. So, the the initial really brutal crackdown in March 2021 by the military regime, it specifically targeted the garment worker factory district in Yangon, which was the stronghold of the union. It went in there and just kicked out female union shop floor activists and slaughtered them. It targeted them for murder and crushed the union. There's still actually the unions have been rebuilt in those factories, including lots of new personnel. Uh, but they're underground. They're not able to operate openly. That factory district is under martial law, highly controlled. And then the train workers, likewise, the military has had to take over operation of the trains across the country. And it is just, through brute force, shoved aside the train workers. So they are still doing CDM. They're still on strike, but, there's scabs running the train systems. So, I feel like this type of crackdown had worked for the military in the past. In traditional national large-scale organizations, opposition organizations, when they're not armed, the military controls all the armed force. They cannot stand up to it. The military is able to crush and break up those large-scale organizations. So, like 1988, 2007, those revolutions were defeated for that reason. And if that had been the only form of organization, it might have worked again. But a lot of the workers who had that experience of trade unionism, who still identify as individual members of their trade unions, even if their unions aren't operating normally, they, through social media and modern technology, and through the mass, support of people for this struggle all over the country, are still able to organize on a smaller scale and build these new kind of autonomous independent organizations everywhere with whatever people around wherever they were, even if the trade union center isn't operating, even if the trade union leaders are under arrest or have had to fled abroad. So there's still, that makes initially building solidarity a little more difficult. Okay, because if you're an international trade union looking to work directly with another formal trade union structure organization, it's not so clearly apparent always. But trade union personnel independently organizing themselves and other masses around the country are still, at the foundation of this revolution.
In the early days after the coup, I read an article someplace that tried to suggest that the fight of working people in Myanmar should be concentrated against the military government and not particularly against the employers. This sounded like a strange thing to say when it was quite obvious that the government and the employers were working quite well together to suppress the unions in the factories. I saw this only once, but it reminded me of stories I heard about other places in the world where a union movement was supported by what are called solidarity centers, often set up by the international sections of the U.S. Trade Union Federation, AFL-CIO, which at one point was notorious for working with the U.S. CIA in a number of countries. I asked Michael if he had heard anything about this.
Yeah, I'm not aware in particular of Solidarity Center's position, but there has been similar voices. The EU some EU organization put out a report a few months ago, earlier this year, saying that international garment industry businesses should not boycott Myanmar, that they should do business, open up garment factories, reopen in Myanmar, and just focus on having higher ethical standards. And, this is against the actual Myanmar unions, which are calling for a boycott. And, their argument is that only a small fraction of the income the profits from this sector are going to the military, and that hundreds of thousands of families depend on it. And that may be true, but the position of the actual revolutionary organizations on the ground is for an international boycott of the regime. And people are willing to make harsh sacrifices now in order to not return to a situation of normal under dictatorship, not to go back to that life, and to go all out, do everything possible to overthrow this regime, not try to compromise and figure out a way to normalize under it.
I asked Michael what he and the people he was working with in Myanmar thought about the pace of the struggle.
Yeah, so the military side of the struggle, the resistance, is definitely continuing to make ground. Since late 2023, throughout this year, the pace of the resistance victories has picked up, and they're taking over more and more territories, more and more towns. But it's mostly in the borderlands. The NUG, National Unity's government, has been to focus on liberating the ethnic minority areas first. Because those areas were struggling against the regime for decades, while past, dominant ethnic Burmese opposition parties had done nothing to support them and left them to, withstand the military's brutal repression on their own, and the need to make up for that. And then also that these areas, these pre-existing ethnic insurgencies are better armed. They control the border areas. They have access to black markets for weapons. So, it's important for the military aspect either way to focus on liberating these areas first and gaining the trust of the oppressed ethnic minorities, and having faith that through that, once they have liberated their own regions, that they will, willingly want to support the continued resistance war in central Burma to overthrow the military in its strongholds. And, there's optimism that that stage of the struggle is nearing its completion, and that it can quickly go from that to striking some major blows at the regime. In particular, Naypyidaw, the capital that was just built, in the late 2000s, 2010s, the new capital city, is located in a very vulnerable position for the regime, actually close to the Karenni, the ethnic Karenni areas, which are close to full liberation. So the hope that the front lines can move to those type of regime strongholds in the near future. I think that's possible. I also think that this revolution can take a long time. The struggle for central Burma can take years longer. In particular, if the revolution, the Spring Revolution, does not get any real substantial international support. This is an increasingly difficult time for normal people, where thousands of people are being called up for conscription by the hated military. People who joined the protests in 2021, who for one reason or another have been unable to flee and join the resistance, the People's Defense Forces, until now, have been stuck in the city, are now being, conscripted and having asked to fight for the fascist side. And the economic crisis is spiraling out of control. So this can still be a very difficult period for Myanmar people if they don't get support that is needed to pick up the pace of the struggle and to liberate central Burmese areas quickly. And yeah, in 2022, the U.S. Congress and the Biden administration passed the Burma Act, which promised eventual aid for the revolution. But until now, that support has not come from the U.S. or from any other country. So in the past few months, there has been some steps towards delivering at least non-lethal military aid to some of the ethnic resistance groups, like helmets and body gear and just other things that, even if it's not the weapons that they really need the most, would still be extremely helpful for allowing them to more effectively fight back. But at the same time, I think the regime's international backers, they've been very silent since 2021, since the coup, because I think they didn't really think the resistance had a chance. But over the past few months, as the resistance is scoring more victories, they're starting to realize that Min Aung Hlaing could really be in trouble, that his regime is really in danger of falling. So you're starting to see more international propaganda coming out, more of a concerted effort to try to undermine the reputation of the revolution and to block the delivery of that promised aid from the U.S. that still has not actually arrived yet.
At the end of our conversation, I got Michael to agree to join me again in conversation on a couple of issues we didn't have time to discuss during this conversation. This included one of the big questions that needed to be decided, hopefully sooner than later, which is, what will the government look like the day after victory? The fight is not only against a military government, but is also for a fight for freedom, for human rights and trade union rights, and gender rights. Tied to all of this is the discussion of the rights of the Rohingya population, those currently in Myanmar, as well as the refugee population in Bangladesh. The elected government of Myanmar that was overthrown by the military had a horrible position on the Rohingya issue, and at a minimum helped the ethnic cleansing that took place in the country. That's a discussion that will happen next time. And next time on today's program is a reading of a poem by one of the more well-known of Myanmar poets, Khat Thi. Poets have high status in Myanmar, and they often played an important role in the revolution. They were often targeted also by the police, as was Khat Thi. He was arrested on March 8th of 2021 and murdered by the government while in custody. This is a poem he wrote on February 14th of the year of his execution. It's called Survival Account and is read in Burmese by Protest and Strike Committee leader Bo San Ne. We'll have an English translation immediately afterwards. I'd like to thank Michael Sladnick for the audio and for the translation.
ရှင်တန်ကြီးရှင်တန်သူရဲကောင်းလည်းမဖြစ်ချင်ဘူးအာဇာနီလည်းမဖြစ်ချင်ဘူးပြောညံ့သွေးကြောင်သူလည်းမဖြစ်ချင်ဘူးမတ်ယူရဲလည်းမဖြစ်ချင်ဘူးတူဝေ6ချားသူလည်းမဖြစ်ချင်ဘူးကိုပြန်အဆက်ရသူလည်းမဖြစ်ချင်ဘူးရှာဖြစ်ခံရတဲ့ပြောရေးဆိုခွင့်ကိုကြုံမှုတယ်အကျဉ်းချခံရတဲ့လူအခွင့်အရေးတွေနေဘူးတယ်တာကြောဖြစ်ခံရတဲ့နေ့ရက်တွေနဲ့ရှင်သန်မှုတယ်ငါတို့ငရဲကိုငါတို့နဲ့ပဲဆုံးသက်ခြင်းတယ်ရေပေါ်စီနိုင်ငံရေးသမားမဖြစ်ချင်ဘူးစိတ်ကူးရင်ကြပြစရာမဖြစ်ချင်ဘူးအာရမဝါဒကိုထောက်ခံတဲ့လူတစ်ယောက်မဖြစ်ချင်ဘူးရှင်သန်မှုဟာ10မိနစ်ပဲကြံတော့မယ်ဆိုရင်အဲ့ဒီ10မိနစ်ကိုတောင်လိပ်ပြာတန့်နေခြင်းတယ်ခတ်တီ
Survival Account. I don't want to be a hero. I don't want to be a martyr. I don't want to be a pathetic coward. I don't want to be a fool. I don't want to be a vacillator. I don't want to be embarrassed of myself again. I've been a spokesperson who had my tongue cut out before. I've lived through the imprisonment of human rights. I have survived the neutered days. We want our hell to end with us. I don't want to be a politician who goes with the flow. I don't want to be a poet who indulges in fantasy. I don't want to be a person who supports inhumanity. If I only have a minute left to survive, I want my soul to be clean, even for that minute. Well, that's our show for today. I'd like to remind you that you can follow Michael's Facebook page, Myanmar Solidarity, and follow some of what he sees in the country. And I'd like to thank you for being with us today. I'm Wayne Heimbach.